Now, I don't know how much we've explained this to you, but we're making tapes, and these tapes will be preserved in the Kansas State Historical Society archives. And arrangements have been made to do that and everything. So the questions we're going to ask you and your responses to them and everything will be stored for posterity or something. Anyway, it's kind of exciting. It will be available in transcript. We will have them transcribed. We'll work with you on that and let you see the transcription of it and approve of whatever is written there. And then the transcription also will be made available both at the Historical Society and here at Washburn too. So this body of data that we're gathering is not just for us, but
you're only interviewing female legislators?
At the beginning, to get a manageable number to start the project, we needed to have some way to separate it because there are so many. When you get beyond the women, we've identified, 65? We're not sure. Oh, somewhere over 65 that are still living that we will be able to interview. And that was kind of a manageable number. If we get into the larger numbers, I don't even know. We don't even know the numbers of them.
Yeah, of living legislators, I wouldn't know either, because I can think of a number of alums out there in western Kansas that I've met who are former legislators.
So this is just for a year, so we're trying to get all of these done in 1 year, and that's maybe a little bit of a challenge at the end. It's not hard yet, but it will get to be that way.
Did you got a grant, did you, from
from Washburn.
Good.
We're both in the, what do we call it, the Center for Kansas Studies, whatever that is. We're both members of that, and kind of got the idea through some things that were brought up there to do this. We got a lot of encouragement from all sources. And I think the State Historical Society is anxious because there's really no information. I don't know what you found out about the legislature, but there's no book. There's really, and this will be.
I think Pete McGill.
Yes.
No, wasn't.
No, it wasn't. It was before
Harder. It was Bob Harder.
Yeah.
Wrote a book about the legislative process.
That's even old.
McGill's written some books too. Yeah, and it's hard to describe it like it really is in any kind of a publication.
That's right, and that's why this will be special, because the people who were there and doing it are going to be describing it.
And Ray Powers, who's head of the State Historical Society, is urging it very strongly and is connected with some larger monies that this could be a seed project for doing all legislators possible. So we hope it's the first step in a bigger thing that Washburn can do.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
We have some questions. We're just kind of going to take turns asking you, and if you feel like talking about something else, that's okay.
Politicians always take
it off
that
in any
license.
direction you want to. What years did you actually serve in the legislature?
I was appointed in 1984, and then I served through 1988.
Okay, that's right. You were appointed.
I took L. Wayne Pomeroy's place when he resigned to take a position on the Parole Board.
Okay, so you were there for how many months before
I was
you had
appointed,
to be elected?
I think it was June 1st in 84.
And then you had to be
And then I
elected.
just went right into an election year.
So you weren't there really during a session or anything?
No, I was on interim committees that first summer, though. I think I was on the Judiciary Committee and the Education Committee. Those were assignments, I think, that L. Wayne had.
Had you thought about running prior to your appointment, or were you waiting for him to retire, or what?
Well, I worked for Senator Cassabaum at the time, and you always wonder whether you made the right decision. I loved working for Nancy. She was, I worked in her campaign in 78, and I thought, and in 78, I started working, it was like April of 78. She announced in March she was late getting into the race, and they had 9 Republicans in the primary that year. And so, a lot of people didn't think she had a chance. And I had a friend here who was involved in her campaign and wanted me to come to meet her because I didn't know her previous to that. And so we had lunch, and she was looking for a Shawnee County chairman. And although I'd worked in some local races, I'd never worked in a statewide race. And she said, well, would you, I'm looking for a Shawnee County chairman. And I said, well, what does a county chairman have to do? And she said, oh, I don't know, not a lot. Well, I ended up worked full-time that whole summer and then took a leave of absence because I was finishing at Washburn in the fall, because I really kind of planned my whole summer around her not winning the primary, after August the 6th or 7th or whatever it was that I was going to be available. And then when she won the primary, everybody in the campaign kind of reorganized their lives. But I finished at Washburn because I'd gone back after Paul graduated. And then when I graduated in 80, the person who had gone to work in her Topeka office was leaving. And she asked me then if I'd want the position in her office here, which was entitled Regional Representative. And you just I had responsibility for Northeast Kansas in the 2nd Congressional District. And so I traveled with her and for her and did constituent services in that area. And I love that job. It's really, to this date, it's my favorite job that I've ever had. But I was there 4 years, and I think you do you observe the governmental process, and you see that people, sometimes are satisfied with the result they get when they have to deal with the government. Sometimes they're not. So I think it's logical, if you're interested in politics and government and like people, that you wonder if you can do that job yourself. So when Pomeroy was resigning in 84, I loved my job. I really wasn't even looking for something else to do, and it was really my political friends, they do it to you all the time, who encouraged me to think about running. And I thought about it, and then of course the idea kind of catches on, and people begin to call, and you're always flattered. That's what I see today with young people who are approached by the party to run for legislator, for elected office, is that it's a compliment. You feel flattered that they asked you. And sometimes I think there's a danger with young people that they get involved too early. And for me, I think it really wasn't a good time for me, because I still had, my children were like, in 84, they were 8 and 12 or something like that. And so they really still needed a mother at home, and Paul's an attorney, and his job is real busy, and it keeps him out of town a lot. And I just, sometimes when you have children and someone has to take the responsibility of being the anchor person, and I happen to be the anchor person in our family. But it wasn't that I couldn't do it. The kids were in school. It was, I didn't think it would be any more demanding than a full-time job. And so I put my name in and was appointed at the county level, and then found myself in a full-fledged campaign, and ran against Vic Miller, who was a young attorney, and he'd been in the House for 6 years, and it was a real challenging race, because he ran a real hard race, and I did too. So there was a lot of satisfaction in winning.
How much lead time did you have in planning that campaign? Not much.
Well, I didn't have any primary opposition.
So you could devote yourself to the general.
Yeah, I think there was plenty of time there. Sometimes you might. Well, Nancy didn't start her statewide campaign till March, so starting in June on a Senate district was. I don't think I really started. I did do some door to door, I think, after the 4th of July that year, and then did some up to the primary, and then laid off a little bit in August, and then started up in September again. But it was Miller had some name identification, a little easier name, so that was probably the biggest obstacle I had to overcome, was just his name identification.
How close was the vote?
It was about 1,000 votes in the end.
Well, that's quite a few, really. It was a good win.
It was a win.
Who worked for you? Who were some of your campaign workers? Where did you find people that had time and energy? And
I always think it's fascinating in campaigns, because most of my friends aren't political. So my friends were willing to do grunt work kind of things. If they would get together on a Saturday and paint yard signs, or they would help me address things, things that didn't require contact. But when you got to the more political kinds of things, like phoning and doing door-to-door, where you're actually knocking on the door, that most of my non-political friends, those aren't fun things to do. if you don't enjoy that kind of thing. And but I had a lot of party people who helped. There are always people who come out of the woodwork who don't like the other candidate. That always happens. So there were people who didn't like the other candidate. There are people who are just party people, and they look for someone every campaign to work for. And a lot of the people who helped in Nancy's campaign in '78 helped me. I had some really good help from that. And my husband was a good big help. He was real energetic about and enthused. You know, it's in every campaign there are people who come out of the woodwork who, for no obvious reason, really knock themselves out for you. You don't know them ahead of time. You don't know what their motivating factor is. You know, I used to speculate that for some it was maybe they did have a job. You know, maybe you'd be able to help them find a job if they needed a job. I had people who were going through divorces that just needed something to do with their time. People who are just kind of wanting to break into politics and just wanted to have the experience and knowing what campaigns are about. But there's lots of different things, and sometimes you never know what someone's motivating factor is. And then sometimes it becomes real obvious after the campaign is over. But so whenever I have know people who are running, and they're always concerned about, will they have enough help? The help will be there. You know, I always tell them the help will be there. The thing that you also learn in the end is that the person that you have to rely on the most is yourself. And to run in a political race where you have stiff opposition, you have to want it real bad. You have to just really want it more than anything, and you have to be willing to just organize your whole life around it. And if you don't want it that bad, then, you know, all the help in the world might not make it a winner.
Oh, that's interesting. Your district at that time your senatorial district included what?
Well, there's 3 Senate districts in Shawnee County, and
have they been changed?
They have been changed a little bit because of reapportionment, but I had, the east edge of my district was Washburn Avenue. Went north all the way to the county line. Now it jogged a little bit going north, so I had all of the western half of Shawnee County from the middle of the county over. In mid-county, I never went south of 21st Street till you got out in the townships. And then I had Auburn, Dover, Willard, Rossville, Silver Lake. I didn't have any of Sherwood, though. But it was a very diverse district because I had downtown Topeka. I had, I didn't have Westboro because it had been gerrymandered out last time they did reapportionment. But I had Midtown, a lot of older retired people. And then I had, Silver Lake has a lot of labor people there. Rossville has a lot of farm interests and, kind of people who've moved out of town because they didn't want to be in the urban setting. And Auburn has a lot of the same kind of people. Auburn and Rossville's kind of typically Democrat. A lot of the farmers that move to that area are Democrats, while Auburn is more Republican and some real hardcore conservative Republicans. So I really had, but the registration in my district was more Republican than Democrat, but with a very large unaffiliated vote.
That's interesting. What issues then? I guess you've identified quite a few of them, but what did you focus on? They had a lot of diverse interests, so how did you try to appeal to all of them?
The interesting thing is that when you're going door to door, people don't ask you so much about issues. The sin issues were big then. We were talking about parimutuel and liquor by the drink and the lottery. Those were some big issues. Abortion wasn't such a big issue because it was still at the federal level. Although for the people that issue is very important to, they didn't really care whether you didn't have much control at the state level. They still wanted to know your position on it.
What did Vic Miller focus on? What issues was he?
He mostly talked about his experience, the fact that he was an experienced legislator. There weren't very many just basic issues where we differed on. Of course, the tax issue wasn't a big issue.
Well, it's a different year then.
So what did you do right more than he did right? What do you think you did that got them to vote for you?
Well, first of all, Shawnee County has been very good to female candidates when you look at the makeup of the Shawnee County delegation. And I think in '84 that trend was pretty strong. I based my campaign on what I thought we did use television. Both of us used television, which is kind of a little unusual in a Senate district. It's not a very effective use of your money, but I felt like I needed the name ID that television would give you, and television is a very, very dynamic medium. It all of a sudden you can be on television for one day, and people who didn't know you from Adam all of a sudden are recognizing you at the door. So it's very, very powerful. I did a strong door-to-door campaign. As I said, I started out, did some in June, some in July, and then once August was over, I was out going door to door, at least on most days about 8 hours a day, which was some in the morning, some in the afternoon, and the evenings when you could catch more people home. Yard signs are real important in Shawnee County because I just think people in Shawnee County are accustomed to seeing yard signs, and for a lot of them, it's a curiosity, and if they happen to see that your opponent has more yard signs than you, then they wonder why. Well, the Phelps may be an exception to that, but maybe we should edit that out.
Okay, we will.
But I just think my campaign was a pretty standard campaign, but I made every effort to go to every public forum that I could, and the TV I think helped, and just a door to door, because people like to see you at their door.
Now, did you do the same thing the second time around?
Basically. Basically, the second time around there were some. Of course, then you're an incumbent and you
That's
have a
right.
record, and that makes a lot of difference. I think the retirement issue was a big issue in my second campaign, and it's not an easy issue to explain. My Senate district has more state employees than any other Senate district. And so when you deal with a bill that's 72 pages long, and 71 and a half pages of it have to do with state employees' retirements, and then half a page has to do with enhancements for the legislative retirement program. And the day I went, this was considered the day before the last day of the veto session. And when I went on the floor that day, Charlie Dodson, who was the lobbyist for CAPE, the Kansas Association of Public Employees, I said to Charlie, what do you want me to do on this one? Because they were objecting to the enhancements for legislative retirements too. He said, we want this bill, we really want this bill. Because it did do some good things for state employees' retirements and kept some windows open for some employees to take early retirement. And so, I had to wrestle with, should I vote yes and and hope that that's the right thing, or should I vote no and hope that it'll go back to committee and have that legislative retirement business taken out. And my seatmate, who was from Wichita, when I voted yes, he said, that's a bad vote, Jeannie. But I said, and he was always weighing the political consequences of the votes, and I didn't make a practice of doing that. I felt like I had to represent my district, and on that particular issue, my district was better served for me to vote yes. And so, I mean, I was in the state employees retirement plan, but I hadn't joined it when I first was in the legislature. I had joined it a couple years later because I had taken my money out of my federal retirement, figuring I would probably never be a federal employee again. And so I would not have been vested even after my next term. So, you know, it was something I would have benefited from eventually if I'd signed up for it, but it was not something that I was really looking at. I mean, and frankly, that was an issue I think the Republican leadership let us down on, because that was amended in committee. It was explained on the floor by President Talkington, who was president of the Senate then, who later retired, later announced his retirement, and it was not explained. It's hard to explain. You know, now they've done in-depth studies on what it did, but when you're just explaining it on the floor of the Senate, it's explained pretty briefly, and it's hard to tell just from a half-page explanation unless you're familiar with the technical parts of the Capers Act, which I wasn't. And you know, it would have been easy to vote no, and then, but then it might have gone back to the committee and never come back to the floor. So it's just one of those things. I felt like I did the right thing. And then another issue that I think was, it was a factor. You know, when you lose by 900 votes the second time, you don't know what all the factors are. But the legislature had passed a third phase of state employees reclassification plan, and the governor vetoed it. And so Alicia Salisbury and Alicia has a lot of state employees in her district too, talked to the governor before the end of the session, once during the summer, and I talked to him myself once towards the end of the summer, because it was within his power to implement it by executive order. You know, he could have then arranged it any way he wanted if there was some objection he had to how it was passed by the legislature. And I had, you know, when you think of the kinds of state employees that I had in my district, they were state hospital employees, K&I employees. They were, you know, lower income level people. I ran on to, you know, state hospital employees and state hospital employees' families, their mothers and fathers, who were really upset with the governor vetoing that. It wasn't an issue that anybody else understood, but these people understood it, and they figured if you have a Republican governor and you have a Republican legislator, there ought to be some way that they can help you out on that issue. And that it was a phased-in reclassification plan. They'd done the first phase when they scheduled it, the second phase when they scheduled it. The third phase was the biggest phase, included about 50% of the state employees, but at a lower level. And, you know, for them to just say, well, we're not going to do this year because we can't afford it, I didn't think was a very good explanation. But then the government did it, implemented by executive order the Friday after the election.
I forgot. That.
So there.
That could have made a big difference.
It could have made, I don't think it would have made enough difference, but it could have made some difference.
Well, with your district, who knows? It's really hard to say. Well, when you were a freshman, I guess you were kind of a freshman before you were even elected. Did you have any mentor or any particular legislator? You mentioned Alicia Salisbury in the Senate that you sat by and maybe talked.
Well, Alicia was elected the same time I was,
right. So she wasn't even there yet.
She and I kind of we commiserated a lot, but we didn't really. I wouldn't say we mentored one another. The year I was elected in '84, ended up being 5 women in the Senate that year. There was.
That's the most, wasn't it? That there
I think that's the most there's ever been.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's 5 now or not. I can't. Alicia and Audrey, Norma, Nancy. There's 6 now.
There's 6,
so there'll be more now. 2 Democrats, Norma Daniels, Nancy Parrish, and I like Nancy very much, and she and I got along fine. And then Audrey Langworthy from Johnson County, and Alicia Salisbury. Well, as it happened, and we didn't plan this in any way, Alicia and Audrey and I were in a suite right next to one another in this big suite down on the first floor. So it was an opportunity for us all to kind of keep one another up on what was going on. And as it happened, between Alicia and I, we were on nearly every committee that there was in the Senate. So, and committee activity is really, really important. That's where you really get an understanding of the issues. So Alicia and I would kind of work with one another if there was something coming up on the floor that maybe after reading the bill that something I didn't understand, I'd talk to Alicia about it, and she'd do the same thing with me. And if things came up on the floor, amendments on the floor, on a bill that we, one of the other of us had in committee, that we would talk about it, and that was really a big help. The men do the same thing.
Yeah,
It's just that before there weren't ever enough women to do that, and the men would do it with you too. It's just that Lish and I both coming from Shawnee County and having similar kinds of districts, even though different, but similar in many ways. And sometimes Alicia and I and Nancy would all commiserate on, especially things like school finance that, affected our districts in different ways because of the school districts. So and the odd thing was that there were 3 women from Shawnee County then, the 3 Senate districts, and they were all females.
Well, now, you and Alicia, you each served on half of the committees. Which committees did you serve on?
I was on transportation. I was vice chairman of judiciary, not an attorney, but that was a really, that was an excellent assignment for a freshman legislator. I served with Bob Fry, who was chairman then, and Bob was very, very kind and very patient. And although my husband's an attorney, so we have some legal talk around the house, there are a lot of things that if you don't have background in the law, they're more difficult to understand. And so Bob was, if I would say, well, what's the background and how did we get to where we are today on this? He was always patient enough to explain what the changes in the law had been up to that point. It helped you to understand why they were trying to change it, whatever they were trying to do. I was on, I chaired the confirmations committee. I was on governmental organization and elections. So I had some really good committee assignments. I particularly liked transportation and judiciary, but elections, elections is kind of a minor committee, but there are a lot of things that go through elections that can have a big effect, like ethics issues and campaign finance issues.
Besides your committee positions, did you have any other leadership positions while you were there? What kind of bills did you sponsor and introduce and become party to in some way?
Well, as a freshman legislator, you certainly can introduce bills. There were a couple things that I introduced that had to do with child protection issues and crimes against children. Just
like a hawk. Okay, keep going.
But basically, as a freshman, the parties always give freshmen opportunities to co-sponsor bills. It's just if there are issues that are coming up that maybe have to do with tax or maybe had to do with tax. It's a good example. If there's a party position on it, or a medical malpractice was an issue that was very hot when I was first in the legislature, and ways to implement tort reform. Lots of really complicated things, which I was involved in because I was on the Judiciary Committee. But I did sponsor some tort co-sponsor some tort reform legislation and some legislation specifically related to medical malpractice. I also chaired a subcommittee my freshman year that looked at changes in the Kansas law that had to do with child support enforcement. It was the year after the federal government had changed their requirements on what states had to do with regard to child support enforcement, and there were some specific criteria that state programs had to meet. So I happened to be in judiciary over the summer, and we had updates from federal agencies on the federal requirements. Then I took those bills to a subcommittee, and we, with the help of staff, wrote a major bill we have this major, like 50 pages, trying to bring Kansas into compliance with the federal government. So I worked that. I chaired that subcommittee, and then I carried that bill on the floor, and it passed. And that was a major piece of legislation.
Yes.
I felt good about that. I felt good about my contribution on that, and it was something that was worthwhile and has been paying dividends for women in Kansas and for Kansas too since then. The tort reform the next summer I served on the medical malpractice special committee, and I think that we made some recommendations from that committee that were carried in the legislature the next session, which I then on occasions chaired subcommittees that looked at them. We made some corrections, I think, in some tort legislation that helped to reduce the pressure on medical malpractice rates. And tort reform, I think we studied tort reform 2 summers, and we made some progress on tort reform, but it's one of those issues, where the doctors are pointing their finger at the attorneys, and the attorneys are pointing their fingers at the doctors, and there's some blame on both sides. So it's trying to balance their interests, or they're not interests, but their positions with the people who are victims in those cases, tort reform, tort kinds of cases.
Now, there were 5 of you in the Senate, 5 women out of 40. Were there issues that the men looked to you for, women's issues that they would ask you to comment on, or I felt like that there were women's and men's issues? Were there? What were they? What was this?
I'm not the child support enforcement. I think sometimes there was a danger in getting women too involved with any particular issue. I remember one time that this was when we were doing the child support enforcement bill, and I was carrying it on the floor. Well, Frank Gaines, who is infamous, and I mean a true male chauvinist. Frank is. I like him very much, but he's come from the old boy network, and he's been there a long time. And so I spoke on a question, and then I think Audrey Langworthy spoke on a question, and Bob Fry spoke on a question, and then I think maybe Alicia made a comment, and then Frank stood up and he said, "Well, you girls," and but I think that they did, but it was a more casual thing, that maybe in committee they would look to you. See, I didn't serve on committees that really handled any of those kind of. I specifically didn't want to be on health and welfare.
That's what I was going to say.
I didn't want to be on that because Jan Myers chaired that committee for years and years and years, and I mean that would have been a logical place to put the women, put them on health and welfare. What is it?
Yeah, that's right.
Is it health? There's something else in there. I can't remember, but public health, I guess, was what we called it in the Senate. And I was interested in the public health issues, but frankly, on the Judiciary Committee, I saw more of the issues I was interested in. Children's issues, adoption issues, crimes against children, family issues. A lot of SRS questions came through the Judiciary Committee, and So I got some satisfaction out of considering those issues, but they weren't really identified in any way as particularly women's issues. Because frankly, the men are interested in family issues too.
Well, how would you describe yourself? Are you a conservative or liberal or something else? Or how would you describe your positions on all the issues as far as that goes?
I always used to consider myself a thoughtful conservative. Because I think some conservatives aren't very thoughtful. But I think that I was more a moderate conservative. I was, as a Republican, I was pro-choice on abortion and against the death penalty. So those two issues alone put me a little outside of my basic party structure. And, sometimes you'd feel a little, sometimes I felt like I was a little out of step. But on the finance issues and other issues, I considered myself a conservative. But it's just on some of the moral issues, I don't think anyone would have considered me a conservative.
Well, did you participate in any formal or informal coalitions or groups? Now, I think right now, this year, maybe last year, they started having a women's caucus. Fairly formally. Was there anything like that?
We had, Joan Wagner and I kind of cooperated on getting the women legislators together at least once during the legislature. I'd get the Senate side organized, tried to find a day that everyone could come, and Joan would circulate a notice on the House side. We did that, but the interesting thing about women legislators is you can get them all in a room and they don't agree on what issues, they don't agree on abortion, they don't agree on capital punishment. Most of the issues that you'd think would be women's issues, they don't agree on them either. So there were times that we would try to identify an issue as being kind of non-controversial enough that we could get people motivated on them. And frankly, right now I can't even think of a good example of that. But we also wanted the women legislators to know one another, because you get there and you're so busy, and sometimes you don't take the time to get to know one another, and that is really important. Having those friendships and those associations, people that you trust, people that you know are going to be knowledgeable on the issues, whether they're men or women, are important. But the men, they've been at it longer, and they really do mentor one another. They really, although I've observed that there are cases where no one finds a mentor, that no one particularly takes this person on. As a matter of fact, my seatmate was Eric Yost, and Eric is controversial sometimes. Right now he's vice president of the Senate, but he's very outspoken. He was more conservative than I. For the death penalty, against abortion, on moral kinds of issues, and Eric took a different approach to the legislature in that, as I said, he really measured the political consequences of every vote, because Eric wants to have a political future. He's looking at running for Congress or something down the road. And there were a lot of times that he and I had differences of opinions. But sometimes, just when I would think they're picking on me because I'm a girl, then I'd observe that Eric was getting picked on in a similar way on something else, and it was more because we were new than because I was a girl or he was a guy. It was really more because we were new. And frankly, the legislators who've been there, knowing the rules and knowing the process is a big advantage. And they can take advantage of you. They can, just tell you enough to get you to go along with their side, or tell you half the story. And if every issue up there has been around and around and around and around, and the ones who've been there for the last time they discussed it have the advantage of all the background, and those are things that you don't have the advantage of. So I think sometimes when I felt that I was maybe being picked on, maybe being singled out because of my sex, I think it was more because I was new. But most of the men, and I say men, frankly, Nancy Parrish I could always go to. Norma Daniels, who'd been there longer than Nancy, wasn't really someone you could go to. She really never expressed an interest in spending any time helping you understand an issue. And there were some men who would and some who wouldn't.
What do you remember the most? Now, you've talked about a few things, but do you have any particularly vivid memories of your worst defeat or your greatest victory or your biggest nightmare or anything like that?
Well, actually, I took some flack because of my involvement with the so-called puppy mill business. And I never planned, Ginger was involved with that, and I never really planned to be a human, an animal rights activist. I do like animals, but I didn't go up there with that agenda in mind. But in sometimes most freshman legislators, and since I was only a freshman, that's all I can relate to. You're not going to get involved in a major tax bill. Probably you're not going to be in on the groundwork for some major tax bill, because most of the time, they're kind of written by committees of the leadership who are going to impose the party position into the bill. And I knew that I had to understand the process in order to be able to be effective. And there were some opportunities to make the process, to be involved in the process at a lower level that gave you the experience on knowing the rules and working the process that you needed to be effective later on. And the puppy mill business did that for me because I was working on it. I happened to be on the committee that considered that, and worked with the people who were interested in it and getting the bill drafted the way they wanted it. I worked the committee on getting the votes in the committee to get it out of committee. And then it was amended on the floor of the Senate. And this was just, to me, it was just a really interesting exercise because the men there, Don Montgomery was on the other side. He was fighting the puppy mill legislation. Don was successful in amending that bill on the floor of the Senate and making it, neutralizing it totally. And then he had worked all his buddies to get them to vote for the bill. Well, there were some people like Gus Bogina and Bud Burke and some people from urban areas who had the active humane societies who were telling their people at home, yes, I'm going to support you on this, I'm going to support you on this, but they voted for Montgomery's amendment and then voted for the bill thinking the people back home wouldn't understand. Well, the people back home did understand, and so they rallied, they made phone calls, they called and they said, well, what are we going to do now? And I said, well, it's going over to I can't remember if it had been in the House first or if it, I felt like I'd done my bit because I debated the man for 2 hours on the floor, and I had talked to a lot of these people, and they said, oh yes, they'd support me. Well, they voted for the bill, but they also voted for his amendment. So I did feel strongly that what we were trying to do was important in the small scheme of things, as important as puppies are. And so I just began to look for vehicles to amend the original bill into on the floor of the Senate. So I found a vehicle one day, and I worked all of my people, and I called the night before the bill was going to come up on the floor that I was going to offer the amendment to. I stayed until I had my 21st vote. I made phone calls, and I finally counted to 21. Well, that didn't give me too much comfort because 21 is easily 20, and then you lose your amendment. But I went home, pretty confident I had 21 votes. So the bill came up, was one of the first bills on the calendar that day, and I got ready to offer my amendment. And Nancy Zolgerman, who worked for the Senate Majority Leader, then came out and she said to me, "They just took Jim Francisco to the hospital. They think he's having a heart attack." Jim Francisco was one of my 21 votes. So I said, oh, and I wasn't going to even offer this. Some of the men who, after they had, and I say men because they were, not because it was a sexist issue, but came to me afterwards and said, "Oh, we want you to try to offer an amendment to get this back up on the floor of the Senate because I'm really in hot water with my constituents back home." Well, I almost just said, "You offer the amendment. I did my thing, and you can bail yourself out." But I got some encouragement from some of the other people who were men also, who said, "No, come on, we can win this." So anyway, I went ahead and offered the amendment because I didn't know whether there'd be another vehicle come. And I picked up one vote I hadn't counted on, and it passed anyway. And then it went over to the House that night and was approved by the House. And I mean, in the whole scheme of life in Kansas, that bill isn't that important. But it was working the process and understanding the process and knowing the rules and what you could do and what you couldn't do that gave me some experience that helped me down the road. Because really, when you come to those very controversial issues, there are, the little nuances of the Senate rules that are different from the House rules that you can have all the votes in the world, but someone can stop you dead just because they knew the rules better than you. Mm-hmm. And so, and when you're in the majority party, you can make the rules work for you, but you have to know them. You have to be able to recall them when it's appropriate. And so I do find the legislative process really stimulating and really fascinating, and that's all part of knowing the rules and the process and being able to get along with people.
Yeah. Well, did you ever, did you learn all this while you were in there? Did you have a relative or a friend or anyone you knew earlier in your life that was in the legislature? No one preceded you then? Because a lot of people, have relatives or friends that precede.
My parents really have no interest in politics. They live in Kansas City, and they didn't even come down for either election night. I mean, they really don't care that much about politics and didn't care that much about having their daughter involved in politics.
Well, you're a native Kansas City, Missouri.
I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, but I lived there all my life. And Paul and I moved to Kansas after I married Paul, and we moved to Topeka in '72, so he could go to law school here.
Can you tell us anything about your background, your education, your friends, your schools, your family?
Well, I grew up in Kansas City. The oldest daughter of 4 children in a Catholic family. I went to Catholic school all the way through grade school and high school, a small Catholic school in Kansas City. St. Pius X is where I went to high school. And I was always a good student, but I really wasn't interested in politics. I really, even government wasn't. Although I was the vice president of my senior class. And I think I more like the challenge. I like the election process, and was kind of involved in school activities. Although I had a job from the time I was 16 until I went back to school when I came to Washburn. So I worked all the time. I was at least for my junior and senior year in high school. And so that cut out a little bit on the activities I was involved in. My dad's a retail salesman, and my mother never worked. So, it was just a basic lower middle income background. And then when I graduated from high school, I went to the junior college. I won a scholarship, actually, 4 years, wherever I wanted to go. But by then I was engaged to Paul. And he was in the military, and I didn't know when we'd get married, and that was kind of, I mean, at that point, women were kind of, especially when you go through Catholic school, you find a nice Catholic boy and get married and have children. And I was just thinking the other day about the lack of any kind of counseling where I went to high school about what you might do. If you're really good in math and science, what are some of the options for you? And so I didn't really think about that too much. When I graduated, I went to junior college in Kansas City, and computer science was a big thing then. That's where the money seemed to be made. So I went into computer science as a major and went to school for 3 semesters. And then Paul was wounded in Vietnam. He came back, we got married, and spent his last year in the service at Fort Dix. And our daughter Stephanie was born at Fort Dix. And so he had a year and a half of college also. So when we came back, he finished his undergrad at Central Missouri State, and then we moved to Topeka, and he went to law school. And then after he graduated from law school is when I went back and finished. It was kind of a long, drawn-out process, but my mother tried to tell us when we were 19 and 21 that it would be easier to finish school and then get married, but we didn't listen. So,
what was your major at Washburn?
Economics. I have a BBA in economics.
Well, now you've kind of described a few, maybe not organizations. You said you were vice president of your class. Are there any other organizations that you think kind of led you or helped you to understand the legislative process or leadership or anything relative to doing that?
I always had kind of, there were a number of times during school when I had leadership activities in organization, and
go ahead.
So I think that was just kind of a skill, and I don't really know where I got that. My mother's are kind of a dominant factor in our family, although she, as I said, she never worked till we were out of school. She was president of the PTA, I remember, one year as a kid. So there was some encouragement for community involvement when I was a kid. When I did move to Topeka, I got involved with the Republican Party here. I was a Republican before, but I was never really involved in party politics. When Paul was in school, I worked for Bill Bunton, who was in the legislature then, and he was county chairman then. And so I signed up to be a precinct committee woman. And as I said, worked for a couple local candidates who I knew, and then I was vice chairman of the county party. That was 1978 or 80. And I'm always kind of caught between balancing my home, because I really feel strongly about being around for my kids, and I think I said that earlier, that was one of the drawbacks of being a Shawnee County legislator with children at home. At the end of the day at the Capitol, I always went home just to make sure everyone was having dinner and they'd started their homework, and sometimes it was real hard to get back out, to go to receptions and things. And I think for women who can go away from the legislature or who don't have children at home, you don't have that guilt that you're always trying to balance your home interests with your legislative interests, and that was a problem for me.
All right.
Got married during the legislature, and not during the legislature. She got married in the summer, but Alicia was planning that when she was during the session. But Audrey, she came away. She had daughters, one who was in high school, one who was in college, but she came to Topeka, and she managed her own time, so she didn't have to worry about whether someone was fed, whether there were groceries at home, whether people had. I suppose she worried about that before she came away on the week during the at the end of the weekend, whether someone had clean shirts, and so I do think that living in Shawnee County makes it possible for some people to run who couldn't run if they were leaving home for 3 months, and I couldn't have left home for 3 months, but it also it creates a certain amount of guilt in that you're always kind of trying to make judgments about where you need to spend your time, and for me sometimes that was hard.
Do you think your family sacrificed too? I mean,
yeah, I think they did.
What kind of things do you think they?
Oh, I just think that there were times that I could have been home helping with homework and other things. Not that it didn't get done, but what my son, who was he must have been 8 when I was first elected, would have been 11 or 12 when I lost the race in '88. For him, at his age, there's a lot of attention. People know your mother's a senator. You get some attention at school and some friends that you might not have otherwise. I mean, it shouldn't be that way, but it does happen that way. And people, you get to be around. You get to go to the governor's house, and you get to be around people that you might not get to be around otherwise, and people pay attention to you. And after the race in '88, people always encourage you to run again. And so one day I said to Jeffrey, would you want Mother to run for the Senate again? He said, oh, no, I wouldn't want you to do that. Oh. And I thought, well, that's really interesting because, for him there's an upside. And I didn't think he would observe the downsides very much, but he said, oh, no. So I didn't push him to see why he felt that way, but he obviously felt pretty strongly. But some people like Nancy Parrish, she has a fairly new baby and has children at home, and she seems to be able to do that. So it obviously can be done.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think that being in the legislature changed you or your life in any way? I mean, did it set you off in a new direction, or other than the people you met?
Well, I think the people you meet is a big part of the experience there, and the people that I know in Shawnee County, whose doors I knocked on, people I see at the grocery store now, who, I remember from a brief conversation, or they remember me and remind me that, I live on Webster and you came by my house. But I think it gives you a certain measure of confidence. I think it's a good accomplishment to be able to go to the legislature and feel like you did a good job, and I feel like I did a good job and understand the issues and maybe make a difference in some small way. And I think it gives you the confidence to go out and say, I can probably do just about anything I set my mind to do. I couldn't be a brain surgeon, but I think it gives you some confidence and some good experience in working with people, and that's basically where my experience was before in working in Castlebaum's office. And in the alumni office, I enjoy my work there. I really do miss the issues. There's only so many alumni events that you can plan and feel fulfilled about it, especially when you get, a 10% turnout on the number of people that you invite. But I enjoy working with people, and I enjoy meeting Washburn alums. I enjoy being part of the university atmosphere.
Well, you've mentioned some contributions that you've made in some of the bills. Is there any other major contribution you feel that in your term of office you helped your district or the state or someone else, or big or little?
Well, I think one of the things that I did really well was constituent services, and I do think that I made a lot of people feel better about their legislature or about government. And I think that's very, very important, because people have a real low regard for elected officials. And you take somebody like Dick Snyder, who writes column after column after column about issues like the legislative retirement, And he really encourages people not to have confidence in their legislature. And when I used to speak to groups, I'd say, you can be turned off by the legislative process. You can choose to ignore the legislative process and never have any input. Don't fill out questionnaires and don't go to public forums. But the truth is that you can't avoid being affected by their decisions. So if you don't participate on the front end, then the only thing is left for you is to complain afterwards. It's the percentage of people who have contact with their legislators is such a small percentage. But most people have opinions about what's going on over there. And I used to try to do speaking engagements whenever I had a chance, and I used to do a lot after the legislative session on updates, and I used to do some during the session on what was going on. But I'd get a lot more invitations to tell about what happened after it happened than I would get to explain what's going on and encourage people to be involved. But, government is, people just want to complain about it all the time, but they don't want to take the initiative to know about legislative candidates. I mean, there are some people running in this election cycle, and there are some elected officials in Shawnee County now that are an embarrassment to the system, but yet people voted for them, and you sometimes it's a matter of voting against someone else who's already there, but it's pretty frightening sometimes what makes people make up their mind. And I guess that's one of the fascinating things about politics in general, is that it's really a study of what influences people on issues and candidates, and it's a continuing process, and it's pretty fascinating.
Well, do you think that as a woman there were certain expectations of you because you were a woman as a legislator, either from your constituents or from the other legislators?
I think as a woman legislator that it's, and maybe this will change with time, but I think that your activities after hours are more scrutinized. That that men going out to go to the legislative activities, and I wasn't out that much because I went home, but there were a lot of other people who didn't have they weren't going home, and they would go out. And during the time I was there were rumors about several of the women legislators I knew, and most of the time, they weren't true. And so I just think that things haven't evened out up there yet with regard to the standards you apply to female legislators as opposed to male legislators. And I mean, you'd like to think that they both have high standards, but there's some things that there are some things that have gone on there for years. I mean, I think the after hours activities have cleaned up a lot from what I've heard they used to be 30 years ago. But I think I can't remember what the question was. But
well, I was kind of leading into another question too. Do you think women have equal influence in the legislative process? Either, well, probably from your point of view of having been in the Senate. Do you think that women senators are as effective as men?
I think they can be.
You think they have the opportunity to be?
I think they can be, and I think having the seniority is what makes you effective, and being there and being knowledgeable on issues and getting to the point where people come to you like they go to other people. See, there has never been a woman in a leadership position in the Senate. And as it happens, the women who are there now who have the most seniority are minority party members, so that explains them. And Nancy, at least, has had a leadership position in the minority party. And so Alicia and Audrey, who are the majority party members, haven't been there that long. They're both in their second terms. And both have, I think, Alicia, I can't remember, I don't think she chairs education, but she does chair another, I can't remember. I talked to Alicia quite a bit after the election about what committee assignment she was going to request, because the real power at the legislature is in the committees. And if you can have a committee chairmanship, you can, as far as the issues that go to that committee, you can have a tremendous influence. And so, that, I think that you've got to pay attention. You've got to, and I think you've got to think about, where do I want to have an influence? And some committees deal more with governmental agencies like governmental organization and public health. They deal with a lot of constituents, but they also deal with a lot of agencies where committees like transportation and judiciary have more public exposure. You're going to federal and state affairs, which to me is just the pits of a committee. But I mean that's where all the publicity is, because they do the death penalty and they did all the sin issues. And I mean, if you're going to find cameras in any committee during the day, it's probably going to be in federal and state affairs. And I mean, they're in the whole scheme of things, they are not doing the most earth-shaking things. I remember one time when they were considering. I can't remember. It must have been when we were doing reappraisal and classification, and they were having a committee hearing in the old Supreme Court room, and there were a lot of people there. I'd gone to hear the hearing. I wasn't on the committee, and I looked around the room and I thought, if a bomb fell in this room right now, we'd lose about 150 lobbyists and maybe a half a dozen citizens. They were doing, and now people are protesting because of what happened during that time period, but people weren't there to hear what's going on. And it's just an interesting process, because a lot of the times when the major decisions are being made over there, the only people who are really there to having their input are the lobbyists. And there aren't very many lobbyists like Common Cause and some of the lobbies that are underfunded but represent the average taxpayer. There just aren't very many of them.
That's a good point. Did you have any?
I think
questions?
I've got a couple of cleanup ones,
All right,
and they're almost answered. Just what scholarship was it that you won, your 4-year scholarship? Was it out of your...
It was a W.T. Grant scholarship. I worked at Grant's when I was in high school in the office, and they did a scholarship, and it was a competitive scholarship, and you actually took a test for it, but they also then went by your ACT or SAT scores, I can't remember. So it was, and when I turned that scholarship down, believe me, my mother was brokenhearted. I mean, the option for me was then to go to junior college, which was $4 a credit hour at the time. The only way I was ever going to be able to go 4 years away to school would be if I won a scholarship. And my mother, it's not a subject we talk about today, even, So, but I was bullheaded, and I decided I was going to Paul and I were going to get married, and I remember telling the people at Grant's that I probably was going to get married before the 4 years were up, and it'd probably be better that they gave the scholarship to someone who took advantage of it for 4 years.
Well, I commend you on your honesty. Okay. Why are you a Republican? What is it about, I gather you sort of started out a Republican, you became more so one. But what is it about the Republican Party that makes you a Republican?
It probably basically revolves around the theories of redistribution of wealth. I I believe that we should encourage people to take risks, to invest money in creating jobs and creating capital, and that if the people who are willing to take those risks shouldn't be overly taxed to support people who aren't willing to take those risks. And, I think all of us have to support basic social programs. We all have to support the people who aren't able to support themselves. But it's like, with Paul and I have never had anything given to us. We both came from, Paul's father was a Fuller brush salesman, so neither one of us have ever, we've worked hard for everything we had. We got married young. He worked while he went to school, then I went back to school, and now we make a good living, the two of us. But what we pay in taxes is just, to me, it's absolutely onerous. And we don't have any way to avoid our taxes because all of our money comes from 2 paychecks. And, there are some people, I suppose, who have lots of money that they haven't created that's come down through generations of other money that you probably can make an argument for that money should be recirculated better. But, I just think that, and it even happened, my parents are Democrats, and I tell them all they should be Republicans because they work hard for their money. They've never collected on one social program in their whole lives. They worked so that 4 kids of the 4 kids, 3 of us are college graduates, and my sister at least has 2 years of college. And, they've never taken advantage of any of that. But, they support all those programs, and I don't know. But I also, as I said, as a thoughtful Republican, there were lots of times when issues came up with regard to, programs for children and families that are very, very necessary. And so then you've got to, it's a real struggle to find a balance between, how much of that wealth you are going to redistribute, and then leaving enough with the people who've created it so they have the incentive to go on and work and create more.
Okay, I got one final question, which is not cleanup. It's a big one. It sounds to me like you've been thinking about this. You were thinking about it when you were in office, and you've been thinking about it afterwards. What kind of person becomes a legislator? Do you feel as though people should be legislators for life? Do you like the idea of different people being legislators? What perspective do you have on the job of being a legislator, and who can do it, and what it costs, and what kind of person should be one?
I support a citizen legislature, that people who come from, whether they're lawyers or housewives or teachers or in private business, that they they're somehow able to take 3 months away from what they do and come to the legislature and participate in the legislative process and then go back to what they do. In my job in Nancy's office, I wasn't able to do both of those jobs because you can't be on a federal payroll and also be an elected official. Well, then at that point, it's a little harder to find a part-time job that you think gives you some, makes you feel like you're doing something worthwhile. And so I chose not to have another job. But what I think we need to resist is the temptation to go to full-time legislatures where you have, and that's why I think that legislative pay should never be enough to really compensate you for your time. It really isn't now. I mean, even with 2 or 3 interim committees in the summer, you maybe make $18,000 to $20,000 a year. For most people. For some people, that's more than they made doing whatever else they were doing. I think that's a danger because then then you have people who are willing to do that for a living. But I think it's a real mistake when you go to professional legislatures and that's what they do for a living, because I think there's a real value in bringing people's perspectives together, whether it's business, labor, whatever, and in using them in the legislative process to develop ideas and debate ideas. When you have a full-time legislature, I think that's when special interests really begin to have a real hold, and they become more and more influential. And I think it's easier for people to get away from the real world and what's going on and what people want, and be more influenced by special interests.
Good answer. Is there anything we haven't asked you that you wish we would have? We forgot.
It really is a stimulating experience, and it's one that I really enjoyed, and I feel like I gained a lot from. And it helps you in understanding. Voters so often, they have this black and white idea of how issues are, and it would be wonderful if you could somehow in a tape cassette give people a short course in how complicated issues are and all the different things you have to consider, and so that they maybe would think about issues in a little more depth and consider them. One of the reasons I consider myself a thoughtful Republican is because I think it's too easy to consider issues according to a particular philosophy. You can say, well, I'm a conservative and I'm going to vote no on all these spending issues, like the rebel Republicans did this year. They just they took a philosophical stand on where they were going to be, and Reagan, I think tended to be that way, that he was more philosophical. And that's why Bush appeals to me more, because although he tends to be conservative, he's more thoughtful in his approach, and it appears to me that he's willing to listen on issues and make his mind up more on the merits of the issue than on just, party philosophy or philosophical lines. I think that's probably was my major frustration in trying to explain issues to people when so many times they'd made up their minds, or they wouldn't listen to both sides. They just chose to listen to the side they're interested in, and I don't know how you do that, and it's typical. I think that the news media could do a better job. I think they're biased. I think the local paper could do a much better job on covering the legislature or issues at the university or anything. And I used to be often frustrated with them because I think they bear a big burden on influencing people's opinion, and sometimes they don't. I don't think they take that responsibility as seriously as they should.
That's a good point.
Well, this has been wonderful.
Yes.
Well, thanks.
I'm going to just introduce it. You were telling us that one of the factors in your defeat was the Democratic registration drive. Could you just tell us about that again?
Well, the Democrat Party in 1988 made a major get-out-the-vote effort, and I think it probably would stand some kind of scientific survey that they're probably, Republicans may be more conscientious about getting registered than some Democrat voters. I don't know whether that bears anything or not, but that's kind of my opinion. And in some of the areas of my district where there were more transient voters, in the apartment complexes and in the areas where there was just more turnover in residents, there are always big pockets of people who aren't registered to vote. a lot of times those people register unaffiliated, but I think they're either easily influenced in their voting decisions, or they maybe tended to vote on the Democrat ticket. So in the end, I had an occasion because the last update I had on my voter printout was about a month before the end of the campaign. So I ordered a printout of everyone who had registered to vote in my district for the last month before the election. And it was over 2,000 voters that had registered in my district during that month. So see, those were people who not only had they probably not paid too much attention, but they also weren't getting any of the mailings that we were doing. And normally you wouldn't worry too much about those people. I had people constantly who were going to the courthouse and getting lists of people who just registered. But normally in that last period, you wouldn't have that many people who were registered to vote. So it wouldn't be a big factor in anybody's election if you never got those names. But and there is a cutoff period. That was the last month before the cutoff of the voter registration. But 2,000 people makes a lot of difference. And as I said, people who probably hadn't gotten any of the material you'd sent out up to then, and they'd been contacted by somebody from the other party and encouraged to vote for my opponent.
And you did say that their process was very thorough. That
they obviously, because the election commissioner is a Republican, she's somebody that I see. But she told me after the election that they were very methodical, and that the process is that you have to carry a card with you and have the person fill out the card and either mail it back to the election commissioner's office, or you can volunteer to take it for them. Normally they would volunteer to take the cards after they'd been filled out, after days worth of knocking, to the election commissioner's office, and the election commissioner would mail out the material. It was the actual voter registration material, and then they would check back to see if that material had been returned, and then if it hadn't been returned, I'm assuming that they went back to the person who'd been sent the material, or either contacted them by phone, by mail, or in person, encouraging them to return the material, because there was a lot of back and forth with the election commissioner's office and following up those voter registration cards.
So as you say, if it was a 900 vote difference, that was a significant.
That and a couple of other factors that I think would have influenced a few votes. And the Republicans in '88 didn't do a get out the vote effort at the polls. Normally, the county organizes poll watchers, and they.
That's okay. Oh, shut up.
But normally the county gets volunteers to watch the polls during the day, and they mark people off as they vote. And then towards the end of the day, say 5 o'clock, they take those lists and they split them up with some other volunteers, and they call people and remind them to vote and see if they need a ride. But the county didn't do that in '88. The Republicans weren't very well organized, and when you have candidates who are out there doing everything they can to win elections, and they're not supported by the party mechanism, when the other opponent is getting a lot of help from their party, that's politics. And we didn't win because we didn't get the effort out, and we didn't get the vote out. So it's clear to me why we didn't win. As we look back on it.
Are you ever going to go back and do it again?
Oh, I don't know. I do love the process, but I don't. When my children are grown, then I may take another look at it.
Especially the son.
Yeah, when I get him out of college, I'll have